All right, so now we move into what I would call one of the most underestimated parts of sustainability strategy. Step 5 is where things become real. Up until now, we've defined ambition, aligned with frameworks, identified material topics, and built KPIs. But none of that matters if the organization itself is not ready to carry it. This step is about assessing the organizational maturity and designing the transformation. In simple terms, we are defining how sustainability will structurally operate inside the company. Not as a side initiative, not as a reporting function, but as an embedded operating model. Because strategy on paper is one thing, strategy inside a system of people, incentives, power structures, something completely different. So we break this into two core parts. First, we assess readiness and diagnose the potential for change. We run what I call an organizational pulse check. How ready is leadership? How ready are middle managers? Do people understand sustainability beyond compliance? Is there cultural openness to change? Are incentives aligned with long-term value creation or short-term financial performance? Then second, we design the sustainability target, operating model, and governance structure. This is where we define where does sustainability sit? Who owns it? How is it activated company-wide? Is there a central sustainability team? Is it embedded into functions? Does finance own climate reporting? Does procurement own supply chain due diligence? Does HR integrate sustainability into performance management? We design the architecture that allows sustainability to move the strategy into daily decision-making. Let's start with assessing the maturity. For sustainability to become an operating reality, it must be linked to governance, accountability, budgets, and incentives. But how you define the level of time, energy, and resources required to bring the strategy to life? This is where the organizational maturity pulse check comes in. Rather than treating sustainability as a one-off assessment, we use regular, structured evaluations to understand where the organization currently stands and how that position is evolving over time. The focus here is not just on strengths, but on gaps, specifically the gaps between the current state and the desired future state of sustainability performance. Identifying these gaps is critical because it creates focus. It allows the organization to move away from broad ambition and toward prioritization. Instead of trying to do everything at once, leadership can see where improvement is most urgent, where capability is missing, and where small changes could unlock disproportionate impact. This gap analysis becomes the bridge between insight and action. It clarifies what needs to be strengthened, what needs to be built, and what needs to change in order to move closer to the organization's North Star. This slide introduces the idea of an organizational readiness pulse check, or what we often call assessing the organization's potential for change. Organizational readiness is about evaluating the organization as it exists today. Its current setup, its activities, and its mindset when it comes to sustainability. The goal is to understand how mature the organization really is in living sustainability day to day, and how ready it is to absorb further change. This type of assessment does two things at the same time. First, it reveals how sustainability is currently embedded across the organization, not just in strategy, but in daily operations. Second, it highlights the gaps that need to be addressed to move closer to the organization's North Star. It also allows the organization to benchmark itself against competitors and external best practices. This helps move the conversation away from internal perceptions and toward an objective, comparable view of performance. So why does this matter? Organizations tend to fall into two common traps. The first is overestimating progress. This happens when organizations believe they are more advanced than they actually are, which can lead to complacency and underinvestment. The second trap is underestimating potential. In this case, organizations fail to see where they could lead, innovate, or differentiate themselves simply because they lack a clear view of their starting point. A maturity or readiness assessment avoids both traps. It brings clarity and objectivity, and most importantly, it creates a clear link between ambition and execution. It helps organizations understand not just where they want to go, but what it will realistically take to get there. To truly understand an organization's sustainability maturity, we use a structured three-step approach. The first step is stakeholder interview workshops. At this stage, we move beyond documents and policies and speak directly to people. These interviews help us understand how sustainability is actually perceived and experienced across different functions. The second step is testing organizational readiness. Here, We assess how prepared the organization really is to drive sustainability forward. This includes reviewing structures, governance, processes, decision-making flows. The goal is to understand whether the organization's current setup can support its sustainability ambitions, or whether those ambitions are constrained by how the organization operates today. The third step is identifying potential for change. This is where insights are translated into action. We map strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities, and benchmark them against industry peers and best practices. This slide focuses on the first step of the readiness approach, stakeholder interview impact labs. The objective here is to surface perspectives, compare them, and understand where views across the organization align and where they conflict. At this stage, we are not validating answers. We are listening for patterns, tensions, and inconsistencies. In practice, this involves conducting 8 to 10 interviews with senior leaders, and the focus is not only on what people say, but on how sustainability shows up in their day-to-day decisions. This often reveals differences between formal strategy and actual behavior. Where relevant, these interviews can be complemented with a short digital survey to capture broader perspectives across the organization and test whether leadership views are shared more widely. During the sessions, participants work with topic cards and structured assessment prompts to evaluate key sustainability challenges. Their scoring highlights the organization's current readiness to implement sustainability, making visible both strengths and gaps. The outcome of this step is a clear, shared picture of where the organization stands today. It shows what is working, where friction exists, and what must change to move forward with confidence. In these impact labs, participants are not answering abstract questions. They work with concrete topic cards and structured assessment prompts that reflect real sustainability challenges facing the organization. Each participant is asked to assess how ready the organization is to address these challenges today. Their responses are not about ambition, but about execution. What is actually in place, what works, and what does not. The scoring follows a simple 5-level maturity scale. A score of 1 indicates a weak state where practices are largely absent or ineffective. A score of 2 reflects an emerging stage where awareness exists but implementation is inconsistent. A score of 3 represents an established level, meaning processes are defined and partially embedded. A score of 4 indicates leading practice, where sustainability is actively managed and integrated. A score of 5 reflects a transformative level, where sustainability is embedded systemically and drives decision-making. These scores are applied across 3 core dimensions. The first is vision and strategy. This looks at whether sustainability is clearly articulated, understood, and linked to business direction. The second is collaboration and processes. This assesses how well teams work together, whether sustainability is cross-functional, and how consistently processes support delivery. The third is action and governance. This focuses on accountability, ownership, decision rights, and whether sustainability is supported by governance structures. Taken together, this scoring reveals patterns, it highlights strengths, exposes gaps, and shows where perceptions differ across the organization. The result is a grounded view of readiness that reflects lived experience, not just documented intent. At this first layer, we're deliberately starting at the top. Vision and strategy are about direction. Before we look at tools, processes, or KPIs, we need to be clear on whether the organization actually knows where it is heading. This means examining the ambition level previously set, but here's where we revisit that. Is sustainability framed purely as a compliance requirement, or has the organization articulated a clear North Star that goes beyond regulation? We then look at how deeply sustainability is integrated into the business strategy. If it sits as a standalone initiative or a side project, it will always struggle to gain traction. Finally, clarity of communication matters. A strong strategy is not only written down, it is understood. People across the organization should be able to explain the sustainability ambition in their own words, without relying on slide decks or policy documents. At this stage, we are not assessing performance, we are assessing direction. The question is simple. Is the organization clear on where it wants to go, and is that direction strong enough to guide action? Once direction is clear, the next question is whether that direction actually translates into day-to-day reality. Actionable integration is the first signal. Sustainability cannot remain abstract. Every department and every employee needs to understand what the sustainability plan means for their role specifically. If people cannot translate ambition into action, integration has not happened. Accountability comes next. Ambition only becomes credible when commitments are binding. This means responsibilities are assigned, progress is tracked, and performance is reviewed regularly rather than treated as a one-off initiative. Cultural reflection is another critical indicator. When sustainability is embedded in culture, it is visible even when no one is talking about it explicitly. Proactive compliance reflects maturity. Rather than reacting to regulation, the organization stays ahead by adopting best practices early, integrating voluntary standards, and often setting internal requirements that go beyond what is legally required. Engagement across levels is equally important. Sustainability cannot sit only with leadership or a single function. Employees from entry level through to senior management need to be actively involved, with space to contribute rather than simply comply. Finally, transparent reporting closes the loop. Clear progress tracking, detailed reporting, and open dialogue with stakeholders reinforce trust and signal that sustainability commitments are taken seriously. Together, these elements show whether vision and ambition are truly aligned with how the organization operates, decides, and communicates. We start with ambition level. The first question asks whether the organization has a sustainability strategy in place. At the lowest end, there is no formal strategy at all. As maturity increases, a strategy exists in draft form, then becomes clearly defined, communicated, and finally fully embedded. At the highest level, every department and employee understands what the sustainability strategy means for their specific role. The second ambition level question looks at how deeply sustainability goals are anchored in the company's overall strategy and vision. Early stages show sustainability as loosely mentioned or disconnected. More mature organizations treat sustainability as a core strategic element, with binding commitments that are not only defined, but also actively tracked over time. The next section focuses on vision and strategy in practice. Here, the question assesses whether the organization prioritizes short-term results or long-term value creation. Lower scores reflect a strong focus on immediate outcomes, while higher scores indicate that long-term goals explicitly integrate considerations. At the most advanced level, long-term sustainability ambitions are clearly defined and translated into aligned short-term objectives. The third dimension addresses culture and mindset. The first question evaluates whether sustainability is truly part of the organization's culture and DNA. At lower maturity levels, sustainability is absent or limited to specific teams or locations. As maturity increases, sustainability becomes embedded across the organization and is reflected in how employees are treated, how decisions are made, and how the organization interacts with external stakeholders. The final question looks at employee engagement across all levels. Early stages show little to no involvement. More advanced organizations demonstrate widespread participation, with employees across functions and seniority levels actively contributing to sustainability initiatives rather than passively receiving instructions. Together, these questions and scoring ranges create a consistent, evidence-based way to assess whether vision and strategy are genuinely embedded or still largely aspirational. Now, moving on to alignment with high-level principles and commitment and communication, both under the same vision and strategy layer. The first section looks at alignment with mandatory sustainability regulations. At the lowest maturity level, the organization is not compliant with required regulations. As scores increase, organizations move from basic awareness to partial compliance, and then to full compliance supported by regular reviews and monitoring. At the highest maturity level, organizations do more than comply. They actively anticipate regulatory developments, adopt best practices early, and use regulation as a baseline rather than a ceiling. The next question assesses alignment with voluntary sustainability norms and standards. Lower scores indicate little or no engagement with voluntary frameworks. Mid-range maturity reflects selective adoption, often limited to specific functions or initiatives. At higher maturity levels, voluntary standards are applied consistently across operations. At the most advanced stage, organizations integrate these norms deeply into their practices and often exceed them, setting their own higher benchmarks for sustainability leadership. The final section addresses commitment and communication. Here, the focus is on whether sustainability goals are communicated clearly and transparently, both internally and externally. At early stages, goals may not be communicated at all or only shared internally. As maturity increases, communication becomes more structured, but may still lack clarity or consistency. At the highest level, sustainability goals are communicated comprehensively, supported by regular progress updates, detailed reporting, and open dialogue with stakeholders. Together, these dimensions ensure that vision and strategy are not only defined internally, but also aligned with external expectations, credible in the eyes of stakeholders, and reinforced through transparent communication. Now, this is where we translate the individual assessment questions we've just reviewed into a single visual snapshot of potential for change across vision and alignment. Each horizontal bar represents one of the 5 dimensions we assessed. The positioning of each line reflects the aggregated score derived from the detailed assessment questions we reviewed earlier, covering resource allocation, implementation depth, performance tracking, and reporting. The scale runs from weak on the left through emerging and established to leading and transformative on the right. The dots show where the organization currently sits for each dimension based on the scoring from the maturity questions. The connecting line makes it easier to see patterns rather than isolated scores. What this visualization highlights is alignment or misalignment across the system. For example, an organization may score relatively high on vision and strategy, but significantly lower on culture or communication. That gap signals friction. It means the ambition exists, but it is not yet fully embedded or consistently lived across the organization. This is why the slide is framed as potential for change, not performance. Lower scores are not failures. They point to leverage points, areas where targeted action can unlock disproportionate impact. In short, this visualization helps shift the conversation from "are we doing enough" to "where should we focus to move faster and more coherently?" This is where everything comes together. Up to this point, we've assessed ambition level, vision and strategy, culture and mindset, alignment with high-level principles, and commitment and communication. We've scored them, visualized them, and identified where the organization is weak, emerging, established, or leading. Here, we bring those results into one integrated view and ask a simple question: what needs reform to move vision and alignment forward? The reform priorities presented here are illustrative examples developed to demonstrate how the assessment outputs can be translated into practical action. This is not a one-size-fits-all solution. In practice, the case examples shown here simply demonstrate what this process can look like in practice when scores indicate emerging or inconsistent performance across key implementation areas. For ambition level, reform means formalizing the sustainability strategy, defining ambition and KPIs, and ensuring clear communication across all departments. This is a board level and leadership responsibility. For vision and strategy, reform focuses on strengthening the link between long-term sustainability goals and short-term operational targets. So sustainability is no longer aspirational, but embedded in planning and execution. Where culture and mindset are emerging, the priority is to embed sustainability more deeply into organizational culture by increasing employee participation and making sustainability visible in HR, leadership, and day-to-day decision-making. For alignment with high-level principles, reform means implementing a structured compliance framework that goes beyond mandatory regulations and systematically integrates voluntary standards and best practices. And finally, where commitment and communication are still developing, the focus is on improving internal and external communication through clearer reporting, progress tracking, and structured stakeholder engagement. Having assessed vision and alignment, we now move into layer 2, governance and management, and this layer answers a critical follow-up question. Even if the ambition is clear, does the organization actually work in a way that supports it? At this stage, we look closely at leadership commitment, not just whether leaders express support for sustainability, but whether that support is consistent, visible, and translated into mandates, priorities, and resource allocation. We then look into internal policies and guidelines. Here, We assess whether sustainability expectations are formally defined, clearly communicated, and consistently implemented. This includes policies such as human rights commitments, supplier codes of conduct, or internal ESG guidelines. The focus is not only on whether these documents exist, but whether they are understood and applied in day-to-day decision-making. We then look at skills, roles, and expertise. This is about how sustainability shows up in the organization structurally. We assess whether responsibilities are clearly assigned, whether sustainability is embedded into role descriptions, and whether measurable targets are linked to accountable owners. A key signal of maturity here is whether sustainability depends on informal efforts or is formally embedded into how people are evaluated and rewarded. Next is cross-functional collaboration and ecosystem engagement. Sustainability outcomes almost always sit across multiple functions, so we assess how well teams work together on shared sustainability targets. This includes internal coordination between departments, as well as external engagement with suppliers, partners, and the broader value chain. We also examine whether sustainability requirements are actively enforced and supported through supplier training and engagement. Learning and development is another critical dimension. Here, we assess whether the organization is actively building sustainability capability through structured training, onboarding, and continuous learning. This helps us understand whether sustainability knowledge is concentrated in a few individuals or being scaled across the workforce. Finally, we look at the integration of systems and tools. This covers the digital and operational infrastructure needed to support sustainability. Without these systems, even well-designed governance structures struggle to deliver consistent results. Together, these elements show us whether governance is enabling sustainability or unintentionally holding it back. In the next step, we use these dimensions to assess maturity, identify gaps, and determine where governance reform is needed to support the organization's ambition. Now we translate the governance and management dimensions into a concrete maturity assessment. We begin with leadership and stewardship. Here we assess the extent to which sustainability is genuinely supported at the top of the organization. At the lower end of the scale, there is little or no board or C-level engagement. As maturity increases, leadership support becomes more visible, but may still be inconsistent. At higher scores, sustainability is treated as a strategic priority, actively discussed in leadership forums, and championed by the board and executive team as part of core business decision-making. At the highest level, leadership commitment is explicit, consistent, and embedded into both strategy and operations. The second area focuses on internal policies and guidelines. This assesses whether sustainability expectations are formalized through policies such as supplier codes of conduct or human rights policies, and how effectively they are communicated and applied. Early-stage organizations may have no policies at all, or policies that exist only on paper. As maturity increases, policies become clearer, better communicated, and more consistently followed. At advanced levels, sustainability policies are fully implemented, regularly updated, widely communicated, and embedded into everyday operational practices supported by training and enforcement mechanisms. The third part of the table assesses the sustainability skills and roles within the organization. It evaluates two things: whether sustainability is embedded into job descriptions and performance expectations. At lower scores, sustainability is absent or vaguely mentioned, linked to targets and integrated into performance evaluations across multiple roles. Whether there are clearly assigned sustainability roles and accountability structures. Early stages show informal or ad hoc responsibility. Higher levels indicate formally defined roles, sustainability champions across departments, and structured accountability mechanisms, ensuring consistent implementation. In short, it measures whether sustainability lives only in strategy documents or is actually owned by people within the organization. Cross-functional collaboration and ecosystem engagement. At the lowest maturity levels, there is little to no collaboration, and sustainability initiatives sit in silos. As maturity increases, collaboration becomes more frequent but may still be ad hoc. At higher levels, sustainability is discussed and delivered jointly across departments with regular coordination. At the most advanced level, collaboration is seamless and embedded, with sustainability fully integrated into how departments work together on a day-to-day basis. The second question looks at how sustainability targets are addressed in cross-functional collaboration. Early-stage organizations may have individual departments advocating for sustainability, but without consistent coordination. As maturity increases, multiple departments begin to actively drive sustainability initiatives together. At the highest level, all departments act as advocates, with sustainability fully integrated into cross-functional decision-making and delivery. The third question expands beyond internal collaboration to the supplier ecosystem. Here, we assess whether suppliers are expected to meet sustainability requirements and actively support the organization's sustainability agenda. At lower maturity levels, no expectations are placed on suppliers. As organizations mature, basic requirements are introduced and communicated. At higher levels, suppliers are actively engaged, trained, and encouraged to contribute. At the most advanced stage, sustainability requirements are enforced and accountability mechanisms are in place. We then move to learning and development, which focuses on how sustainability skills are built across the organization. At early stages, there are no structured efforts to develop sustainability knowledge. As maturity increases, training becomes available, but remains optional. More advanced organizations introduce regular structured training programs. At the highest level, sustainability learning is ongoing, comprehensive, and accessible to all employees, with continuous support to build capability over time. Finally, we assess the integration of systems and tools. This looks at whether the organization has the digital infrastructure needed to support sustainability and transparency. Early-stage organizations rely on manual processes or fragmented tools. As maturity increases, systems begin to support basic sustainability and reporting needs. At higher levels, a coherent system and tool landscape is in place, enabling data collection, monitoring, and reporting. At the most advanced stage, systems fully support sustainability initiatives across the organization, enabling transparency, decision-making, and continuous improvement. Together, these dimensions tell us whether governance structures, collaboration mechanisms, skills, and systems are actively enabling sustainability, or whether they remain barriers to execution. These scores will feed directly into identifying governance gaps and defining where reform and targeted action are required. We now bring all of the governance and management assessment results together in this potential for change view. What you're seeing here is the example of what a visual consolidation of the scores from the previous questions would look like across the 6 governance dimensions. And differences between dimensions highlight where reform is most urgent and where quick wins or structural changes could unlock progress. This slide brings us to the need for reform within this layer. This is where we now translate those findings into concrete reform priorities. On the left, you see the same 6 governance dimensions we assessed earlier, from leadership and stewardship through to integration of systems and tools. These are not new topics. They are the exact areas we scored and visualized in the previous slide. The middle column captures the status quo based directly on the assessment results, and the third column to the right showcases as relevant to this specific maturity results example. For example, leadership shows moderate support for sustainability, but engagement and prioritization are not yet fully consistent across the board and C-suite. Policies exist, but they are unevenly communicated and not embedded across operations. Roles and responsibilities are partially defined, but accountability and ownership remain fragmented. What this tells us is not that governance is failing, but that it is uneven. Some elements are functioning, others are holding the organization back from moving beyond an established level. The right-hand column is where governance reform becomes actionable. This is where we define what needs to change, who needs to act, and in which direction. For leadership and stewardship, the priority is strengthening C-level and board sponsorship. So sustainability is positioned as a core strategic pillar, not an adjacent agenda. For policies and guidelines, the focus shifts to implementation, clarity, and organization-wide training. For skills and expertise, the reform need is to embed sustainability responsibilities into key roles and expand formal expertise. Cross-functional collaboration requires clearer shared ownership and stronger integration into departmental objectives, while learning and development needs to move from limited initiatives to ongoing, accessible skill building across the organization. Finally, systems and tools must evolve from basic support functions into robust platforms that enable transparency, data integration, and decision-making. These reform areas now feed directly into the implementation roadmap, ownership assignment, and sequencing of actions. Layer 3 is where sustainability either becomes real. Up to this point, we have assessed vision, alignment, and governance. All of that sets the conditions for success. But this layer answers a much more practical question. Is sustainability actually happening on the ground? At this stage, we assess whether policies actually shape behavior, especially in areas like procurement, operations, and supplier management. Performance tracking is where accountability becomes visible. Execution requires clear KPIs, defined targets, and regular reporting cycles. If commitments exist but are not measured, reviewed, or linked to performance discussions, then execution remains symbolic rather than operational. Finally, we look at integration into systems. This is often where organizations struggle. Sustainability implementation is mature only when it is embedded into budgeting, planning, procurement, HR processes, and management systems. If sustainability is handled as a separate reporting exercise, it signals a gap between ambition and execution. At this stage, we are looking for evidence. Evidence that sustainability is not just discussed, but tracked, managed, and enforced. Evidence that accountability exists and that execution is supported by systems, data, and decision-making processes. Now, at the highest level, we start with program alignment and certification. Here, we are looking at whether the organization's sustainability efforts are fully aligned with recognized global goals, such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, or net zero commitments. This alignment is not symbolic. It is reinforced through structured programs and, in more mature organizations, through credible third-party certifications. From alignment, we move into measure implementation. Sustainability initiatives are translated into concrete action plans with defined timelines, responsibilities, and measurable outputs. KPI management is the backbone of accountability. Sustainability goals are only meaningful if they are tracked through clearly defined indicators that are monitored consistently. We then look at reporting standards. Mature organizations publish comprehensive sustainability reports on a regular basis using recognized frameworks. These reports provide transparent data, explain performance trends, and clearly show progress against stated goals. Finally, systematic reporting brings everything together. Progress updates are consistent, comparable over time, and accessible to both internal decision makers and external stakeholders. Let's go one level deeper into how execution is resourced, prioritized, and governed in practice. We start with resource allocation. The first question looks at where sustainability sits in the hierarchy of priorities when resources are allocated. At the lower end, sustainability is not considered at all. As maturity increases, it moves from being a low priority, competing for attention, to a clearly defined investment area. At the highest level, sustainability is treated as a top priority, fully embedded into budgeting and resource planning, with consistent financial, time, and people allocation across the organization. Closely linked to this is the second question: how much time, money, and labor are actually committed to sustainability projects? Early-stage organizations may rely on ad hoc or voluntary efforts. More advanced organizations demonstrate visible, ongoing commitment, where sustainability initiatives are properly staffed, funded, and treated as strategic rather than peripheral activities. And the next section looks at focus areas and action fields coverage. Here we assess whether the organization is actively investing in areas like sustainable procurement, local sourcing, and innovation, and whether these investments are aligned with long-term financial performance. We then assess transparency and environmental reporting, specifically around carbon emissions, water usage, and waste management. At lower maturity levels, reporting is limited or inconsistent. As organizations mature, reporting becomes more detailed. At the highest level, this information is publicly available, comprehensive, and used to drive performance improvement, not just disclosure. The following question focuses on social factors, such as diversity, equity, inclusion, and employee well-being. Here we look beyond whether initiatives exist and assess whether reporting is consistent, structured, and supported by meaningful actions. Higher maturity is reflected in well-designed programs, measurable outcomes, and transparent communication. Finally, we assess governance integration. This question examines how deeply sustainability is embedded into governance structures, including board-level oversight and decision-making transparency. At early stages, sustainability may sit outside formal governance. At more advanced stages, it is regularly discussed at board level, supported by clear accountability, and fully integrated into governance processes. Taken together, this slide helps us understand whether sustainability execution is lightly resourced and fragmented or strategically prioritized, transparently governed, and operationally embedded. This assessment is critical for identifying where execution gaps exist and where targeted intervention will have the greatest impact. Moving on to the last two execution pillars of Layer 3 implementation and measures and performance tracking and monitoring. This is where ambition is tested against real delivery. We start with implementation and measures. The first question assesses the extent to which the organization has sustainability programs, initiatives, and certifications in place that support the overall sustainability agenda. At lower maturity levels, organizations either have no programs or run isolated initiatives. As maturity increases, programs become more structured and aligned with global frameworks, including certifications such as ISO, LEED, or B Corp. At the highest level, organizations demonstrate strong alignment with global sustainability goals, supported by advanced programs and multiple high-level certifications. The second question looks at how the organization contributes to national or global sustainability goals through innovation and clean technologies. Early-stage organizations show little to no contribution or rely on minimal innovation efforts. More advanced organizations actively invest in clean technologies such as renewable energy, energy efficiency, and sustainable materials. At higher maturity levels, innovation becomes continuous and strategic, with multiple initiatives contributing directly to sustainability goals and, in some cases, establishing leadership in clean technology adoption. We then move into performance tracking and monitoring, which is critical for accountability. The first question here assesses whether sustainability goals are tracked using defined KPIs and whether deviations are identified and corrected. At lower maturity levels, KPIs may not exist or are tracked inconsistently. As maturity increases, KPIs become clearly defined, regularly monitored, and actively used to course-correct performance. At the highest level, deviations are promptly addressed, ensuring continuous alignment with sustainability targets. The next question examines whether sustainability KPIs are linked to compensation and whether consequences exist when targets are not achieved. This is a strong indicator of seriousness. Early-stage organizations show no linkage at all. More mature organizations introduce partial or informal links. Finally, we assess whether targets and milestones are systematically tracked and reported. At the lower end, tracking is ad hoc or absent. As maturity increases, tracking becomes more structured, with regular reporting. At the highest level, all targets and milestones are systematically tracked and embedded into performance management. This completes the assessment of Layer 3 and gives us a clear basis for identifying execution gaps and prioritizing corrective action. The final question here is simple, but very telling. Do you publish a sustainability report? At the lowest maturity level, no sustainability report is published at all. In some cases, reporting may have been discussed internally, but no formal output exists. This usually signals that sustainability efforts are either fragmented or not yet prioritized. As maturity increases, organizations begin publishing sustainability reports on an occasional or irregular basis. While this is a positive step, these reports often lack depth, consistency, or robust data analysis, making it difficult for stakeholders to assess real progress. At more advanced stages, sustainability reporting becomes regular and structured, with sufficient data covering key topics. However, some gaps may still exist, such as limited transparency in certain areas, incomplete metrics, or unclear methodologies. At the highest level of maturity, the organization publishes a comprehensive sustainability report on a regular basis. These reports provide detailed data and transparent progress tracking against sustainability goals. They are aligned with recognized global reporting standards and are accessible to all relevant stakeholders. What this question ultimately tells us is whether sustainability performance is being treated as an internal exercise or as a public commitment backed by evidence. With this, we complete the assessment of Layer 3 and the full organizational readiness review across vision, governance, and execution. Similarly now, we bring together the results following the same scoring logic and visualizes how the organization currently performs across the key execution dimensions, translated into concrete reform priorities. Based on the scoring results, several areas within implementation were assessed as emerging or sitting at the lower end of established. Once the scoring is completed, the results are plugged into the dedicated AI agent, which is trained on sustainability transformation logic, maturity models, and best practice benchmarks. This allows the organization to interpret what weak, emerging, or established scores mean in context, explore trade-offs and dependencies between focus areas, simulate different improvement pathways and reform scenarios. Let's take this example. Scoring result, for instance, resource allocation, was assessed as inconsistent. Sustainability competes with other priorities and lacks fully dedicated budgets, time, and ownership. Reform therefore focuses on securing explicit financial, human, and operational resources across functions. Explore trade-offs and dependencies between focus areas. Simulate different improvement pathways and reform scenarios. Let's take this example. And of course, you're provided with the ready-to-use Excel template. This file contains the full scoring logic we've just walked through across all 3 layers, with each dimension already structured, weighted, and aligned to the maturity levels. The spreadsheet allows you to capture scores across vision and alignment, governance and management, and implementation and execution. Automatically translate qualitative judgments into a 0-20 score per dimension, and then visualize results clearly across weak, emerging, established, leading, and transformative levels. I would suggest that we visualize the results in a spider chart because it allows us to see everything at once across all key dimensions rather than looking at isolated scores in a table. Each axis represents a core sustainability dimension, and the shape formed by your organization's scores shows the current maturity profile. When we overlay this with a competitor benchmark, the gaps become very visible. The areas where your shape pulls inward compared to the benchmark are the ones that require attention. The red circled segments highlight those reform priorities. These are the dimensions that fall below either the benchmark or the internal average. And importantly, these low-scoring areas represent the greatest opportunity for impact.